Hello, thanks for joining. My name is Emily with Tutoring with a Twist, and this is The Marrow Thieves by Cherie Dimaline. So this week we'll be reading chapters 9 and 10, so that's story part 2 and Migwan's story. In the last chapter, we had Wob's story, and if you remember at the end, um, Riri was there to listen, and this was a problem for Wob. So in this time, Migwans is able to draw on a new story to kind of temper that anxiety there. In this story, in this chapter, we're focusing on two major themes. So one of the big themes that we see throughout the story is on climate change. And the other big theme that we're looking at is this theme of survival. Both of those themes are kind of woven throughout the story. And it gives us a little bit more of a background in this chapter, how things have come to be. So if you're following along, we're on page 87, and the chapter today is Story Part 2. This time, Migwans picked up where he left off the night that Rose first arrived. The earth was broken, too much taking for too damn long, so she finally broke. But she went out like a wild horse, bucking off as much as she could before lying down. A melting north melt the water levels rose and the weather changed. It changed to violence in some cases, building tsunamis, spinning tornadoes, crumbling earthquakes, and the shapes of countries were changed forever, whole coasts breaking off like crust. And all of those pipelines in the ground, they snapped like icicles and spewed bile over forests, into lakes, drowning whole reserves and towns. So much laid to waste from the miscalculation of infallibility in the face of a planet's revolt. People died in the millions when that happened. The ones that were left had to migrate inward. It was like the second coming of the boats. So many sick people and not enough time to organize peacefully. But the powers that be still refused to change and bent the already stooped under the whips of a schedule made for a population twice its size and inflated by the need to rebuild. Those that were left worked longer, worked harder, and now the sun was gone for weeks at a time. The suburban structure of their lives had been upended, and so they got sicker, this time in the head. They stopped dreaming, and a man without dreams is just a meaty machine with a broken gauge. People lost their minds, killing themselves and others, and even worse for the new order, refusing to work at all. They needed answers, solutions. So up here, the governors turned to the church and the scientists to find a cure for the missing dreams. In the meantime, those who could afford it turned to sleep counselors, took pills to go to bed and pills to wake up, and did things like group hypnosis to implant new dreams. At first, people turned to indigenous people the way the New Agers had, all reverence and curiosity, looking for ways we could help guide them. They asked to come to ceremony. They humbled themselves when we refused. And then they changed on us, like the New Agers, looking for ways they could take what we had and administer it themselves. How could they best appropriate the uncanny ability we kept to dream? How could they make ceremony better, more efficient, more economical? That was the first alarm set off in the communities. We thought that was the worst of it. If only. We were moved off lands that were deemed necessary to that government, same way they took reserve land during wartime, because no one cared about long-range things like courting votes for the next election, and instead cared about things like keeping valued, wealthy community members safe. There were no negotiations. We were just pushed off. The new migration from the coastlines was changing geographically daily. And then even after our way of life was being commoditized, after our lands were filled with water companies and wealthy corporate investors, we were still hopeful because we had each other. New communities started to form and we were gathering strength. But then the church and the scientists that were working day and night on the dream problem came up with their solution, and everything went to hell. They asked for volunteers first, put out ads asking for people with indigenous bloodlines and good general health to check in with local clinics for medical trials. They'd give you room and board for a week and a small honorarium to pay for your time off work. But then our distrust had grown stronger, and they didn't get many volunteers from the public. So they turned to the prisons. The prisons were always full of our people. Whether or not the prisoners went voluntarily, who knows? There weren't enough people worried about the well-being of prisoners to really make sure. It began as a rumor that they had found a way to siphon the dreams right out of our bones. A rumor whispered every time one of us went missing. A rumor denounced every time their doctors sent us to hospitals and treatment centers, never to return. They kept sending us away, enticing us to seek medical care and then keeping us locked up, figuring out ways to hone and perfect their solution for sale. Soon, they needed too many bodies, and they turned to history to show them how to best keep us warehoused, how to best position the culling. That's when the new residential schools started growing up from the dirt like poisonous brick mushrooms. We go to the schools and they leach the dreams from where our ancestors hid them, in the honeycombs of slushy marrow buried in our bones. And us? Well, we join our ancestors, hoping we left enough dreams behind for the next generation to stumble across. So that chapter is story part 2. Some of the key themes there are talking about climate change, survival, and then also there's a theme of history repeating itself, this idea of learning from ancestors, but also turning to history to inform our decisions, both good and bad. The next chapter, Back into the Woods, brings us back to the present of our characters, and we'll see a little bit more about their journey. So this is chapter 10, Back into the Woods. There was something beautiful about the way the woods were now. I had no context for a before and after comparison, but I knew that the way things were now could not have existed with so many people and so much scavenging before the wars and the relocations. In this time, in this place, the world had gone mad with lush and green, throwing vines over old electrical poles and belching up rotten pipelines from the ground. Animals were making their way back, but they were different. Too much pollution and too much change. Meg said if we gave them another half century, they'd take everything back over and we would be the hunted. But for now, like always, we couldn't sit around on the couches and contemplate our world and what might lie ahead. We were outside getting ready. Snow fell in a light dusting now. It looked like glitter scraped from the underside of clouds by the scrubby top branches of the pines. The skeletons of the green trees curved under the elegant weight of the snow, bowing and twisting like ribbons in the wind. Last snow of the season, late too. Damn seasons poke into one another with this new earth. Meg put enough weight on to each of us so that we just began to buck and then stopped, patting our loads and looking to the next one up to be burdened. None of us were happy. We wanted to stay at the lodge. It was warm and had walls and made us feel less in danger, less chased. Maybe that's why he wanted us gone so quickly, before we lost the will and instinct to keep moving all together. Wob was still moving slower today after her binge, but if things had changed between us from her cracking wide open like that, she didn't let on. Riri was quieter than usual, but she worked hard to process story in silence, not wanting to prove our theories of her being too young to know the whole truth. We pulled a load of heavy cans and propane canisters and welded hibachi barbecue in the trailer cart we'd found out back of the resort, along with Minerva's share of the camp carry. For now, she was doing okay. The few days inside had done her well, and she sang under her breath and into the top of her sweater. A nursery rhyme about a fiddle and a cat. Had the few days at the Four Winds done me good, too? I wasn't sure. I'd gotten closer to Rose the first night, but then she'd fairly avoided me the rest of the time. I'd heard Wab's coming to story, but I kind of wished I hadn't. It was still too torn on the edges to file away. Having to watch Ree's face from the truth of our predicament was gnawing on me, knowing that she knew there was no conversations to be had, no treaties left to be signed, that we were a product, and that wasn't going to change any time soon. There was the run or there was death with nothing in between, and sleeping inside just made me dream about my brother. It was nice to see him, but always by the end of the dream, he was gone in some horrible rending of kind of way. Better to be in the forest, I thought, where the dreams were shrouded in fog and cold, and the group knew its order and stride by the weight of our want. We're into April now, Mig said. See the buds on those trees? He pointed up with his thin lips. We'll have more cover soon and more sickness because of the wet ground. No time for sickness. At the beginning of winter, most of us came down with a bad cough that shook our ribs and rattled our heads, which responded by leaking thick mucus into our scarves and onto our sleeves. Minerva boiled cedar branches and pine needles into medicine and fed it each of us every 2 hours. Sick makes her nervous, Iguan told me. She lost a baby 1 year to the sick. Minerva had a baby? No, responded Tree. He was one of us, one of the leftovers. But he became hers, and then one winter he died from cough. I did see a panic in Minerva's eyes the next time she stopped to scoop thick medicine into us, opening her mouth to imitate what we should do, as if we were all sick babies she was trying to save. I'm not sure her old heart could take another round of sick and worry. It was tough walking away from the resort. I looked back more than once. What if we had stayed there a bit longer? Would Rose have visited me in my bed again? Would she have gotten over whatever weirdness sat between us now and have even just fallen asleep on my shoulder by the candle fire? I'd never know now for sure. I could dream about it, though. I was thankful for the gift of dreams more than ever. Slopper and Riri were still little, so they were closer to the vicious edge than the rest of us. Their contempt for Mig and his power over the group seeped to the surface. Who made him chief, anyway? Slopper moaned, kicking rocks as we stared into the woods. Yeah, who? Echoed Riri, kicking at the air beside her friend. Her anger was made cute with her little voice and slight lisp of youth. She was wearing a new pair of bright pink rubber boots. She'd found them under the bed and in her room the first morning. Look, they're made out of candy, she said, then licked the shiny surface of one boot and cringed. Not candy. Riri had never had candy, but she'd seen pictures and heard stories about it. So every time something was shiny or bright, and these boots were, she assumed that they were candy. It was a constant a constant disappointing hunt for her. You goof. I laughed at her screwed up face. They're not candy, they're just shiny plastic. Put them on. I helped her out of her old runners that were too big and had been handed down from Slopper. The boots popped on and she stood in them. They fit me, French, she squealed, clomping down the hall one way and then back. I couldn't help but giggle along with her as she stomped by. When she got to the far end, though, she stopped, her little dark head hanging a bit. What's wrong? Do they pinch? Maybe she was niche. Maybe they took her out of her bed. What? She turned around. Maybe the girl whose boots these are got taken. Maybe she had a bad dream and they knew she was niche and they called in the recruiters and they took her. There was a hitch between Took and her. She was close to tears. No way, Riri. If she was niche, she would be too fast for any old recruiter. No one would leave these. She looked down at her shiny feet. No one would leave these on purpose. She couldn't believe her luck and assumed the worst for their backstory. Now that she knew what was really going on, her imagination had a dark streak in it. Nah, I tried to cheer her up. I bet she was some rich kid. The kind with yellow curls and her very own pierced ears. I bet she just had too many shoes with her that she forgot this one pair. I bet she didn't even notice they were gone. Yeah, she stomped past me. I'm going to find Slopper. She made her way down the stairs, jumping down one at a time. I wasn't sure she'd bought my version of the origin of the boots. But the next day, she was wearing them as she chased after Slopper through the huge front room with the double fireplaces. We had been walking since daybreak, but it was noon before we smelled the smoke. Where's that coming from? Slopper lifted his wide nose to the air like a puppy. I smell cooking. No, that's not cooking, it's just smoke, I corrected. Why else would there be smoke? Fire, replied Mig. He didn't seem shocked. He must have smelled it for the past mile, the old fox. Fire without cooking? Slopper looked around for confirmation. But why? Haven't you ever heard of an accidental fire? It was Riri who answered. The fear in her face made me think she must have seen one of those accidental fires up close in her short lifetime. Or maybe it was more of that new dark streak. Slopper mirrored her expression, though he shook his head. No. French. Mick called me over to him. I need you to climb that pine and check it out. Do a 360, would you? I nodded, wiggled out of my burden, and took a run at the tall tree he'd pointed out. I climbed hand over foot for as long as momentum would take me, and then it switched to a slower shimmy until the branches started and I could use them as steps. It grew quiet in the cushion of the brush, the air thick with needles and sap. I paused for a minute and listened. My own breath, the measured thud of my heart, and the slow whoosh of a constant cold wind. Despite the urgency, despite the world as it was at that moment, I felt content. Maybe even a little more than that. I was alive and climbing a tree, and a girl that I was weak for was safe on the ground below. And I was doing something strong to keep her safe, to keep all of them safe. I felt old-timey, and something lush burst open in my chest. Then I resumed the climb, pulling myself from foothold to handhold, till the branches thinned and the trunk narrowed, so that my hands touched on the other side when I hugged it before the next shimmy up. I found a good crook to hold me steady and looked out. The smoke coiled above the treetops, a single cumulus bloom of gray, far enough to the west that it looked manageable. Below it, the trees were moving in impossible directions, shaking back and forth, and then swaying like fainting giants, then popping out of sight. Plumes of dust kicked up as they winked out. Straining, I heard the slow rumble of enterprise, a low, steady thrum. The disappearance of the trees paused, and when the dust settled to a solid haze, there was a flash of yellow in the gap. I sighed, not making sense of it, but understanding enough to know I had to get back to Mig and relay the scene. I began the slow, controlled fall back down. Well, is it food? Slopper called up through cupped hands when I was about 10 feet up. Tree gave him a light chuck on the shoulder. What? Man can't be hungry? I leapt the last 4 feet and dusted off my pants. Mig, it's really weird. You should see the... He cut me off. Let's talk about that up front here, French. No need to bother everyone. But it's so... French. Up here with me. Cheeboy, take the back. Everyone, grab your stuff. He was stern now, back to his order-barking tone. Cheeboy slipped off the trail to reappear in behind the twins. He was used to obeying. I shrugged back to my pack and dragged my feet to follow Mig, upset that I had news I couldn't share, especially with Rose, who looked at me now with curious dark eyes. I could have dragged that story out for a mile at least. Could have spoken in a low voice so I'd have to stay close to her ear. Maybe even thrown an arm over her shoulder. Frigging Meg, so bossy. Riri and Slopper were right. Who died and made this guy chief? Wanted all the info for himself first. I stomped up beside Meg, who kept a few yards to the front. Tell me. I saw smoke and stuff. What stuff? Trees moving and something yellow under the smoke. Where? West. He didn't ask anything more for a full 2 minutes, and we walked in silence. Minerva was feeding her new grandson when the recruiters busted into her home. They took the baby, raped her, and left her for dead. They answered to no one but the Pope himself back then. I unintentionally slowed down, so shocked I couldn't make my feet move with proper cadence. The shock froze into anger, and I sped back up directly beside Meg. He continued. Wab was alone for 2 whole years before she came to us. For the last 6 weeks of that time, she followed us in the trees, unable to trust that we wouldn't hurt her too. I knew she was there. I could see her peeking closer at night when she thought we were asleep. I said nothing, thinking of the story she'd shared with us at Four Winds. Both Riri and Slopper first came to us with a parent each. Both of them lost them to the schools later on. Riri was just a baby when her mother was dragged off. Slopper, his dad, went crazy one night, running straight into a recruiter camp before we could stop him. Stop, I whispered. He took a few more strides. Tree and Ziguan, they were held by a colony of townspeople who tried different ways to extract their dreams, figuring they'd found some kind of personal reservoir with Indian twins. I tried to picture the serious white people as we'd come to know them. In their suits and hard briefcases, closely cropped hair, it was hard to imagine them getting excitable. We found them tied up in a barn, dangling like scarecrows from a rope thrown over a beam. He sighed, paused for another breath. They were full of holes that had been stitched up with rough thread, all up and down their sides, and with a pinky missing on each hand. They were 7 then. I wanted to throw up. I felt the bile burn at the base of my throat. This was my family. I didn't want to know all of this. I couldn't take any more. Stop. Please. I could barely get the words out. I lost my husband in the schools. We were taken there together. Isaac? I asked, remembering my father's first meeting with Mig. He nodded, wincing a bit at the name, like a remembered wound pinching at a nerve. He rubbed the marriage tattoo he shared with Isaac, a story he'd told us when Riri had asked about the black outline of a buffalo on the back of his left hand. That's my wedding ring. Isaac had the same. He slowed a bit, wavering off to the side, nearer to the trees, reaching out to lean against a birch as he paused. I stopped begging for him to stop. Okay, so that's the end of those 2 chapters. I'll post some discussion questions to help guide your reading. And next week, we'll be reading Miigwan's Coming To story. All right, so thanks again for joining. My name is Emily, and we're reading The Marrow Thieves by Cherie Dimaline.